The United Nations is calling for the establishment of a torture prevention body in this country in order to protect prisoners. Experts say this will help in the rehabilitation process and protect the human rights of inmates. For more on this, let's bring in Dr. Mary Nell, who's a senior lecturer in public law at Stellenbosch University. Dr. Nell joins us via our video link today. And Doc, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks indeed for making time. You know, of course, this conversation is off the back of Thabo Bester's escape and just questions, I suppose, about how effectively we're running our prisons. So perhaps let's begin there. Is there a way of measuring whether something like a rehabilitation program in prison is effective?
That's a very difficult question because, I mean, everybody is individual.
Yeah.
So when the prison is sort of crafting rehabilitation options, they obviously have to take into account the offence of the individual inmates. They have to take into account, you know, their history, their age, all sorts of things like that. And there are certain measures in place in prison for people to undergo, for example, anger management courses, courses to do with substance abuse, etc. But their effectiveness is another question.
Right. I suppose the reconviction rate is one place to look at. I mean, of the inmates who leave prison, how many of them make it back for the same, if not similar offences?
Yeah, that's very concerning. And that is to do with many systemic reasons that are far beyond whether a person would want to be rehabilitated. Because if you return back into a community, say now your offence was to do with gangs, say now, and you go back to a gang-infested community, your stigma of a criminal record means that nobody wants to employ you, you don't have family support. It's almost inevitable that you will then reoffend. So it's very difficult for people leaving prison, even if they do want to rehabilitate personally.
That's interesting. Within that context, there's that information I just spoke about of the UN calling for some kind of torture prevention mechanism. Let's unpack that a bit more. I mean, where do those kind of calls stem from? In other words, do we have a reputation as a country of not treating our prisoners well? I know it's counterintuitive for some people, but I mean, those are people who still have rights.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The only right that is actually taken away from one when one is incarcerated is one's right to freedom of movement.
Right.
You know, all other rights people are still entitled to. And yeah, I mean, there are definitely instances where people's rights are violated in prison. Luckily, we do have JICS, which is the Judicial Inspectorate, which is meant to have oversight over prisons and to investigate when incidents of potential torture have taken place. But often people are too scared to speak out, or they don't have an opportunity to speak to a JICS representative. So things sort of go underground, and it's not necessarily the best or the most effective system to ensure that people's rights are not violated in prison.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was about to ask next. I mean, how much sanctioning power, for instance, does JICS have? Not because of their own ineptitude, but because of the context in which they operate in.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, they don't actually have any sort of authority to tell the prison to do this or that. They more sort of can nudge them in the right direction. But that's something different. You know, it's more a moral authority than actual legal standing. But I think that's in the process of changing, which is good. So at the moment, JICS doesn't have complete independence from DCS, which it really needs if it wants to do its job right.
In that moment, I suppose there's going to be also questions around monitoring mechanisms that exist, right? Because, again, as we try to make sense of the Thabo Bester story, there are so many questions around where everyone was looking when all this plan and planning was unfolding, or whether there were people who were involved who knew what was taking place and were going ahead with it because they, too, don't necessarily have anybody looking over their shoulder. Where do you reckon the gaps are?
Yeah, I mean, corruption in any sort of institution is an issue. And I mean, if we're thinking about the people who sort of facilitated, obviously, this incident, we assume that they are also, you know, poor. They also, you know, looking out for themselves. If they can get some extra money, then that's what they do. So, I mean, it's almost inevitable that, you know, people with influence can actually do unconscionable things like this. I mean, it's shocking, but we know it happens.
Sure. It's also brought into sharp focus questions around whether these public-private partnerships actually work. Those in support of it will point to other countries, including the US, that have been using the system for quite some time. They believe it's quite effective. But of course, once you introduce a private company into the running of any establishment, including a correctional services department, there are concerns that that company ultimately goes on to prioritize profits and not people, and that may very well compromise things like rehabilitation programs.
Yeah, no, that's definitely problematic. I mean, if a person is treated as sort of like a unit rather than an actual person who needs help and rehabilitation, that's always problematic. But I mean, that's obviously not confined to private prisons. You know, it's security is the main concern of DCS and also the private partners. Whereas, I mean, rehabilitation ought to be. Because if we think about it, every single person almost in prison, there's very few people who are staying there forever and ever. Of course, there are people who need to, who are very dangerous. But most people are going to be reintegrated into society at some stage. And we need to ask, who do we want those people to be? We don't want them to be angry, bitter people who haven't been rehabilitated. We want them to be people who are pro-social, who are happy to make a difference in their community, who want to change their lives. And if we don't prioritize rehabilitation, we're going to continue having this high rate of recidivism that we have at the moment.
Yeah. And where do we start if we want to get that right? I mean, you and I have spoken about, how it seems that we're yet to even quantify how deeply entrenched something like corruption is. So in the midst of that uncertainty, where does one begin?
Yeah, I think our community instinct is to say, if somebody does something bad, let's throw them into prison, let's lock them away, let's throw away the key. But I mean, that doesn't really, incarceration isn't really a very effective way in fact, it's not an effective way of rehabilitation. There are all sorts of other ways that people can give back to society, restorative justice options that we don't really consider, especially for adults. For children, we consider them to a degree. But for adults, it's basically incarceration. That's it.
How much of that has to do with the moral judgments that are being placed on people who commit crimes, right?
Yeah.
I think in many instances it's difficult to afford kindness or mercy or any prospect of rehabilitation to people who you think are so incredibly bad that they actually just don't even deserve that. And some victims may occupy that position very justifiably because of what they've suffered.
Of course. I mean, and I don't blame people for feeling anger and for feeling resentment towards people who've perpetrated crimes against them. But, when it comes to criminal justice, it's also very tricky because imagine, there are all sorts of people, and I think there are people in prison who are there wrongly. And we just imagine, how would we want to be treated if we were wrongly accused of a crime and then we were incarcerated? So we have to think it from that perspective. But I think it goes back to that issue that I mentioned earlier. Yes, we can hate what somebody's done. But if we hate that person to the extent that we don't think they're deserving of personhood, then we doom them to doing bad things to other people in future once they're released. And that's really not what we want.
It's interesting. Do we have an idea of countries that are getting this right?
And there are countries that are doing much better than us. And I would say, sorry, my light has changed. I think Scandinavian countries are an example of a country where prison conditions are humane. Prisoners are allowed to be released to go and do work. The reintegration aspect starts far sooner than actually when somebody's released. And and because the conditions are humane, people feel that they can, reintegrate into society and that they're not just rejected. And then they want to make a difference once they're released from prison.
Yeah.
So there are models that work much better than our models. And also, as I say, we just assume that, our default setting is send them to prison or even give them a fine they can't pay and then let them be sitting in prison because they can't pay the fine. But there's so many other creative, restorative justice-related, community-based issues or options that we haven't even started to explore in South Africa, which I really think we could.
Yeah. I suppose what we also really haven't done is try understand what pushes people to committing the kind of crimes they do in our country, right? Because therein lies the solution somewhere, I think.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point that you make there. The people who sit in prison I work a lot with people who are incarcerated. And, there's systemic issues that are the reason why the people who are in prison that go far beyond sort of individual evil. There's community frustration in police not doing their job right, people taking the law into their own hands for that reason. And this is why it's mostly, previously disadvantaged black or brown people who actually end up in prison. Not because they're the bad ones necessarily, but because they pushed to it by the circumstances that they're living in.
Dr. Nell, how do we have a nuanced conversation where we acknowledge that, but also don't absolve people from wrongdoing, right? Which is always kind of the tricky part, isn't it?
It's very tricky. I think what we can do is we can acknowledge that somebody's done wrong and then give them the option of making right, of actually giving back to the community, of restoring what they've done wrong. And I think many victims of crime would actually like to know, why did you do what you did? Why did you do it to me? What can you do to make, to almost give back to me now that you've done something wrong, rather than just knowing somebody's sort of abstractly rotting away somewhere in prison. Make it personal, not all victims will be in favor of this, but I think there's a good percentage who would actually want to engage with a person who's done them wrong. And there are also many people in prison who would appreciate that and who would want to reconcile and give back and make right what they've done wrong in a more sort of practical way, rather than just be punished and then go down the wrong way once they're incarcerated. Because prison doesn't make people better. It's not a place where people are tending to be rehabilitated. If anything, they would be recruited into gangs, etc., rather than, it takes a very strong person with a good social and community network on the outside to resist the sort of the temptations of joining gangs and the other threats that are in prison.
Sure. And the question is, how many people who land up in prison have that kind of support to begin with?
Very few.
Yeah.
That's why they end up in prison, which is unfortunate. And I'm involved with an initiative which educates where students from Stellenbosch University and students in prison study together in the same classroom. So I have a lot of chance to engage with people who are incarcerated and hear their lived experience of why they're there and what brought them to this point and how sincere they are about wanting to change their lives. In my case, our focus is on changing your life through education.
Sure. It's a fascinating discussion and very sobering indeed. Dr. Mary Nell, thanks very much indeed for your time. Really do appreciate it. The glory of having a morning discussion is that the sun rises in the middle of the interview and sometimes may blur your view. But thanks for persisting through it. Really do appreciate it.
Right.
Dr. Nell is a senior lecturer of public law at Stellenbosch University, but there's plenty of food for thought there.